Well, thank you everybody for joining us today. I'm glad to speak at this first virtual FutureScape on how we can help you design the future high street. It's really important that we actually do understand that we're changing. The way we use our high streets is changing. The way that we actually will be operating in our town centres will be very different. And I guess many of us would say right at the moment that we would never have thought that we'd get to the situation. If somebody said 5 years ago we'll be in lockdown, we would probably have thought people were a bit bonkers. But where I come from, I actually had the privilege of having one of the first designed shopping areas in the world. The Pantiles in Tunbridge Wells in the late 1600s, early 1700s was set up as the ideal high street, not only where you would go to get your provisions, but also where you would see and be seen. It became a very popular place to be. And really, if we go back to these situations, go back to these early examples of where our towns and cities were not just our shops, but they were actually where we actually spent our time, our leisure time, we can start thinking about what we really want out of our towns and cities. And it's really, I guess we need to ask these quite substantial questions early on as to who is actually going to use the high street. Who are we wanting to make provision for? And there's a number of different classes of persons here we put down, or vehicles, whether it's pedestrians, whether it's cyclists, whether it's cars, delivery vehicles, emergency vehicles, or maintenance vehicles. We need to understand who is going to use these streets. Who are we going to allow actually in them? Because it is as we start narrowing down who is going to be using the streets, we can decide how we actually design them. And then we want to decide who's going to have the priority. And this is becoming a really interesting situation. A question that's being raised in many cities around the world is who's actually going to prioritize in our urban areas. And the problem is, of course, up until now, we've actually been very much vehicle orientated. And that's actually quite interesting because this is changing. And we need to think as to what the future is going to hold. Because it is clear that we're not going to go back to the same situation as we were before. So we need to actually consider this carefully as to who's actually going to be using these streets. And that's actually probably one of the first things we need to consider as to what we're doing. And then we actually look at what the outcomes are that we're looking for. What are the actual principal outcomes? If we're redesigning our high streets, what are the outcomes that we're actually looking for? Are we looking to slow traffic down? Are we looking to increase footfall? Are we looking just to revitalise, change our urban realm, cut the air pollution, maybe reduce our heat island effect, which is a real common issue right across the world? Are we wanting to make our drainage more sustainable within our urban spaces? Are we looking to power our electric vehicles? Are we looking for internet-enabled streets? Are we looking for biodiversity? Or are we looking for all of them? And that's quite interesting because it is possible to actually reconstruct or reimagine our urban areas in such a way that incorporates all of these together. And I think many of us would be actually thinking down that way, or maybe we haven't, and we actually would ought to rethink it. So when we are Green Blue Urban, we're thinking of ways that we can establish an urban landscape that gives us benefits way beyond what it will cost us to install. And one of the things we need to think about is trees. Any who've heard me before will know that urban trees are one of my passions. And I believe that we really need to consider ahead of time what we want to achieve from our urban trees. Unfortunately, in history, there's been a problem with urban trees. Either they haven't thrived and we ended up being very poor specimens if they carry on living at all, or they have grown and they've caused us problems with our urban build-up, with our hard surfacing, for example, breaking up pavings, or causing issues with below ground constraints like drains and water pipes. Now, we at Green Blue Urban have had nearly 30 years of experience on actually getting urban trees established. And we need to design them in really early on. They need sufficient uncompacted rooting space, they need decent protection above ground, and they need to have their roots managed to where they're not going to cause problems. So this needs to come in very early on in the design stage. When we're looking at long-term green infrastructure, it's not something we can just pop in once everything else has been agreed. It needs to be there in the early stage, and we need to incorporate the Arbor system, which actually is a method of giving the tree what it needs away from critical situations. And even in our most designed towns, and this is Poundbury down in Dorset, which is a complete new build town, we still have to think about what we're going to get our green infrastructure. And what's been done here in the marketplace is they've put trees in planters. Now, trees in planters can be put around our towns and cities, but the problem is they are temporary trees. If we want trees that are going to outlast us, if we want trees that are going to bring us those myriad benefits, we actually have to have trees that have rooting system below our hard surfacing. And that's where we need to invest. And this was a site in North London, in Northwood Hills, where Hillingdon Council actually decided that trees were going to be critical to the upgrading of this town centre. And taking away actually a central lane and putting in this line of trees down the centre of the road was central to their plan. And the success has been phenomenal. We have this amazing row of trees giving us the many benefits that trees bring to us. But more than that, creating an enhanced shopping experience. And actually, where there was 30% vacancy within the borough on this road, there's now a waiting list for commercial properties. And that's really interesting because whilst, yes, they did the paving up, it is these trees that has made this massive visual impact. We've had other very interesting examples, and this was Sauchiehall Street in Glasgow, where there again, this line of trees was planted down the centre of what was the vehicle trafficked area, reducing the size of the vehicle road, but actually opening up masses of areas available for cycling and for walking, and actually for just outspill from the bars, the cafes and the pubs, which means creating an outdoor eating area, which has been invaluable during this time of lockdown. And what these trees are, they're providing visual impact, but they're also giving people a sense of safety and that it is safe to cycle down those roads. Another very interesting scheme that we were involved in was one in Woking, where the old commercial street, this actually had commercial way, it actually had trees down there before, but they were causing immense problems with lifting up the paving and other issues below ground. So they took them all out and replaced them with a full soil cell system. Now, this was interesting because whilst we don't have vehicle traffic down here, this is a pedestrian area, it has to take fire engine and emergency appliances when it's necessary. So the whole system had to be designed around taking those very heavy loads, but actually allowing clear space for pedestrians. And it has been a remarkably successful scheme, giving us a fantastic tree canopy and providing these areas of respite and oasis within our towns and cities. It's not only big, you might say, wealthy towns. This is a town in Ystad in Wales, where this was 15 years ago. The local authority decided that a refurbishment of the main street was important. And so they planted trees quite small, but in good soil availability. What it meant was that investment has given a fantastic answer. Very interestingly, the very latest of data that's coming out from reports on retail, saying that actually up to 10% of all our retail floor area maybe have to be realigned or repurposed. What's that going to be? Do we really want to see our high streets just full of perhaps estate agents or coffee bars? Or how do we see people getting back in there? And I just wonder if perhaps like Mistake, we want to start thinking about high street is not just somewhere to go and to shop, but actually get back to the Pantiles, where we would like to spend our leisure time, where we feel comfortable and we feel safe. Working with the London Borough of Waltham Forest, this area in Walthamstow was actually a road that was just a normal street. And what they actually did was pedestrianised it, but made it accessible to deliveries. So although you would not drive along here, we can still get delivery access, but it's principally a pedestrian area. And there again, the trees are central to this, offering great volumes underneath the ground of uncompacted, decent soil, but above ground, not taking up huge spaces which would limit delivery vehicles. Another great scheme was actually in Victoria. Now, this was this is actually just out the back of Buckingham Palace, very high-end development called Nova, and this is actually got this street down in the centre. Now, this is not a vehicle street, this is pedestrian, but it needs to have access for vehicles to maintain the facades of the building, and that would be quite heavy mobile elevated working platforms. But by planting trees in these planters with underground support, so joining the planters together, giving the trees exceptional soil capacity beneath the ground, but not limiting the movement of of necessary maintenance vehicles or emergency vehicles down these areas, it's given these trees the ability to grow to maturity. And up in Scotland, we have done a scheme in Motherwell. There again, this is actually intended to be almost like an urban copse. So this is an area of trees clumped together to give a green heart to the town, but the town is still very much largely in a pedestrianised form. This was a street in Bradford. This is Darley Street. It's actually on quite a steep slope. And this has become very much a pedestrian priority street. Street furniture's been there. Trees have grown in a very healthy way. And this has become an area where perhaps when the sun shines, it's a nice place to be actually to be out there. One worrying fact is that this year alone, up to 125,000 jobs have been lost in retail. Now we're going to have to rethink this, because if we're going to go into just internet shopping, our high streets will not be the draw it could be. Now we can't get some things on the internet, not yet, but we want to think about how we can attract people, not only just to come into our town centres, but to stay there. And actually find that it's not just the shops, it's the experience. How can we upgrade our experiences? How can we think of this movement of people? Because really, retail involves people and attracting them into the area, getting them to stay. Now, it might not only be just a retail area. This is Streatham High Road in London. It's the A23. And it used to be just down the centre of the road was this brick planter. And it was just very harsh. It used to prohibit people moving from one side of the road to the other. And it meant that the traffic dominated everything. Now, this was an early scheme working with the London Borough of Lambeth, and we actually created this central avenue or boulevard of trees right down the centre to replace that heavy brick planter area. And this has been an incredible success. In fact, it's been too much of a success because these trees actually have grown too fast and they require clipping back too often. But hey, I think that's a great story to tell, that trees have grown so well. You may notice that just in the middle of them, there's 5 trees that are smaller than the others. Unfortunately, they got hit by an errant bus. But never mind, the trees are growing really well. And the idea is that gradually they will spread along to actually create a living curtain down the street, help buffer our air pollution, but it's still possible to cross from one side of the road over to the other. Now, one of the things that really concerns us is the fact that is the death of shopping experiences. And we'd be so sympathetic with so many who are now into their second lockdown. And it's a tragedy to the country and to its retail offering. But what we have to remember is that those shops will still be there. Retail, I believe, will come back probably in a different form to the way we're looking at it. I believe we'll probably see more independent shops and that we will probably all begin to shop perhaps more local. But this idea of this massive loss to our retail, these huge numbers of properties that have been left empty, needs us to reconsider, what do we want? Do we want to actually bring some of our out of town stores or out of town entertainments, out of town gyms, or perhaps a lot of other things we could bring back into our inner town, town's high streets? And I think that's really interesting, changing the way we think of things. One of the ways that we're actually thinking actively is to allow for more electric vehicle charging. If people can charge their car in town easily, then they are more likely to come into town for their entertainment, particularly those that live in streets that may not have off-road car parking. Can we provide them somewhere that will actually be a charging point, but allied with shops and retail offerings? Can we make it a pleasant environment? Can we actually start getting our tree pits to be multifunctional? So we get tree pits that incorporate electric vehicle charging points, that perhaps incorporate sustainable drainage features, that maybe incorporate internet enabled functions. And I think it's really important when we start thinking about this, that we aren't just so siloed in our design ideas. It's not just we're talking about trees, it's not just we're talking about urban design or street furniture or highways or drainage. We look at this in a far more collaborative way. We have an understanding of how other disciplines work to actually maximize the advantage we have. I'm working with some boroughs at the moment that are positively thinking about how we can perhaps get small build outs so that vehicles can back up. They can actually start charging under the cover of a tree. We can get some sustainable drainage. We can get some water flowing through the tree pit, cleaning the water, feeding the tree. And it is these ways of working collaboratively that we find is so interesting, because it is when we start joining up these ideas of how we have to excavate in our streets, how we have to plan for it, we start getting considerable savings rather than actually looking at these independently. So this was a scheme that we actually did in Goldhawk Road in Hammersmith. Fantastic opportunity with some brilliant trees that are SUDS enabled, taking the water off the high street, off the high road, actually filtering it through the soil, slowing it down, cleaning it up, trees taking a lot of that water. And we would see this as an ideal candidate actually for including in electric vehicle charging, so that there's a reason for people to come to our high streets. They're not just coming there because they have to, they're actually coming there because there's more things they can do. And I think that really we need to look into that, actually joining it up with street furniture. Do our street furniture offerings give people what they need? Green Blue Urban is offering a range of street furniture now that is actually designed to integrate within our street scene without being too noticeable. We're not looking to increase clutter, but simple designed street furniture that works together to give us what we need in the high street. Thank you very much indeed for listening to me. Thank you for this opportunity to speak of what Green Blue Urban are thinking about. And we're looking forward to supporting you in how we can reimagine, redesign, and actually recreate our high streets, thinking differently, living better. Thank you very much. I've noticed there's a few questions that have come through. Just bring a couple of those up and perhaps just mention them. One question we had is, what about underground utilities? How can we work around the underground utilities we find when we're trying to create below ground situations? Great question. We find that it doesn't matter where you dig in an urban hard environment, there will be utility runs. There will be areas where it's almost impossible to create the routing zones we need, but that's not impossible. What we have found is by careful working collaboratively with our urban utility suppliers, working with local authorities, we can actually work around them. One of the things we find is that trees don't actually need to root symmetrically to have actually symmetry on the canopy. So we can actually get routings that takes a routing zone that's away from the actual center of the tree, diverting the roots to this new area, baiting them into it, and which saves the trees from problem long term. That's a very interesting question. We would just say, let us look into your problem situation and see if we can help. Another question has come up as to how local authorities can afford to do these tree planting in cash-strapped times. And that's quite an interesting situation, as we're finding that local authorities have got some money available, particularly in this time of pandemic, to actually make our streets safer. And there's some government funding for smart streets. There's some government funding for some of our climate change emergencies, which all of these things are which trees can help with. But what we also find is there's been a move perhaps towards getting funding from local businesses. And we've seen some really interesting situations where local bids, business improvement districts, have actually funded some of this green streets to actually encourage people to come in. So in a way, it is the persons that benefit, they pay for it, but it's also available for others. So get together with your locals, say, can we actually improve this area? Can we make it better? Can we work with a local authority to improve our streets? Another question's come in as to whether we need more park and ride schemes to actually get people into our town centres without having to bring their cars in. I think park and ride schemes are great, but particularly as long as you're not having to do a too large a shop. And we see that perhaps using park and ride schemes to get the people in for smaller shops, that shopping experience, make them want to come, prepared to stay, could be a great move forward in many of our towns and cities where it's actually quite difficult to find car parking spaces. Are there any other questions? Anybody want to ask a question? I'm very happy to answer if there's anything else to. Anybody got any questions? Well, thank you very much indeed for listening to us today. Here at Green Blue Urban, we're enthused about the future. We believe it will be greener and cleaner. We believe that as we set ourselves with an understanding, perhaps like we've had never before, of the value of our green infrastructure and actually integrating it with our grey infrastructure, with our blue infrastructure, we'll see resilient cities, sustainable towns that will actually be suited for whatever the future is going to throw at us. So thanks very much indeed, and have a great day.